All right, welcome back, and apologies for that short break, but we really hope you enjoyed those student presentation videos from Bike Club OKC. They're really special and we love learning from them. So in this session, we're interested in learning what are the obstacles and barriers to youth riding for recreation and for transportation. We'll hear from experts across a number of different fields on improving access to trails and roads for youth, promoting safe, active commuting to school, and policy considerations to keep our BIPOC youth safe while riding. Our first speaker of the session is promoting access and safety through policies and programs is Dr. Julian Reed of Furman University. Julian's research focuses on investigating associations between recreational trails and physical activity, as well as examining links between physical activity and cognitive function. He will be presenting today on identification of effective programs to improve access and use of trails for youth from under-resourced communities. After that, we'll hear from Michael Anderson, a program manager at Wisconsin Bike Fed, who will be presenting on the topic of including youth voice to improve public right-of-way. Third up, we'll hear from Leigh Ganzar. Leigh is the measurement coordinator for the Safe Travel Environment Evaluation in Texas Street Study at the UTHealth School of Public Health, as well as a, sorry, Leigh, messing up your introduction here, but Leigh will be presenting on the built environment and policy interventions to promote active commuting to school. And our final speaker for session 5 is Dr. Andrea Hamre. Dr. Hamre is a research associate in the Mobility and Public Transportation program at Montana State University's Western Transportation Institute. She will be presenting on removing opportunities for traffic enforcement violence. As a reminder, you can ask questions anytime to our presenters through the Whova app online. And again, if they do not have time to get to your question during the session, please continue to answer questions there and we'll get to them after the session as well. And with that, I present our first presenter of the session, Dr. Julian Reed.
All right, thank you very much. Hey, go on video. Is that how you prefer it, Esther, or does it matter?
That is perfect.
Okay. Well, thanks for the opportunity, and I want to make sure I don't run too long. So before I get started, I just want to recognize my collaborators from a variety of different institutions. I won't read it all, but you can see right there. And most importantly, I want to and recognize NCORE. So if we can go to the next slide. And you can see here, if you're not familiar with NCORE, examining and trying to prevent and reduce childhood obesity. NCORE sponsored this project, and I'm very fortunate to be able to work with them. And they're a great organization, and you can see here on this slide who are the 4 largest funders of NCORE. Next slide, please. So this project started as a focus on identifying interventions, potential interventions to increase trace among under-resourced youth. And I'll define that very, but think of under-resourced and under-resourced communities as a underfunded. So this paper right here, and you can find it online, is really the research in which we were looking at programs and policies to promote physical activity on trails, and that is not just bicycling. It could be really focusing on walking and other types of pedestrian activity, but we did look at bicycling as well. So this is the research paper, and if we can go to the next slide. Excuse me, let me get out of that so you guys don't hear that. And then we had what we would call the program brief. And so the program brief was really looking at programs that are spread out throughout the country that we often refer to as gray literature. They don't necessarily have a lot of empirical based data. And we hope that a lot of these programs will begin to track that data in the future, but there's still programs that are getting kids out on trails, whether it's walking or biking or hiking. And we refer to it in this case as somewhat gray literature, just because we don't have a lot of the research findings that we would traditionally promote and advocate in the review paper. But we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of these programs. They're so important, and they're getting kids out on trails and getting them active, and they're getting, it's not like they're not getting any data, but we're missing a little bit that prevents us from really including it in the overall research review. And many of these programs are not necessarily interventions, but they are getting kids out on trails. So I encourage you to go to NCOR's website if you want to look at that brief as well. Next slide, please. So what we do know is youth from under-resourced communities, and this be diverse, racial, ethnic, cultural, they're less likely to meet the current physical activity guidelines. And as some of the other speakers I'm sure are going to talk about, there are social and built environment limitations that impact under-resourced youth from these communities. And they have higher rates of obesity and overweight compared to Caucasians. And you can see the under-resourced, primarily we are referring to those communities that are underfunded. Next slide. So there is some evidence that shows active travel interventions can increase walking among children, and active travel that's often, to and from school, potentially can increase that physical activity. But there's not a lot of evidence that activity is really linked to the overall daily activity that we really want our kids and our youth to be engaging in. So we don't have a real understanding of youth from under-resourced communities, and often these are low-income communities, and how trail use is impacting their overall levels of physical activity, which then can have an impact on their overall levels of health. And as you can see here, physical health, mental health, social health. And we know now, especially during COVID, that mental health is so important. Next slide, please. So the primary purpose when NCOR research group that included some of those individuals I showed on the first slide was to say, okay, we have a gap in this literature. Let's go look at and review studies that focus on specific interventions, and those interventions among under-resourced youth and under-resourced communities, and see what they're doing. And so that was the primary goal, primary purpose of this project. Next slide, please. Then we had 3 additional goals. We wanted to look at correlates, right, of physical activity on trails, whether it's transportation, what are other built environment, other land use potential destinations that can promote physical activity and trail use among under-resourced youth. We also want to look at benefits associated with trail use, and there has been quite a bit out there on benefits, and then looking at barriers to trail use as well. Next slide, please. So what we did is what you would do in any type of review, you do look at the variety of databases that are out there and try to find papers that are meeting this criteria, where we're able to look at and see what interventions have been successful, or looking at papers and studies where you can identify correlates with a focus on under-resourced communities. Next slide, please. And so we looked at a variety of databases, whether it's PubMed, Medline. You can see here annual reviews, Google Scholar, American Trails, and you can't see it very well here, and I'm happy to send you this diagram if you want it, or you can get it on the paper. But we started with about, almost 5,300 potential studies, and then we ended up getting to, at the bottom there, 221 that at least met some of the criteria that we've talked about. And then you can see the search, and obviously there was more than the specific terms in the sense that we put them together. So we often looked at built environment, but then we looked at built environment and physical activity, then built environment, physical activity, children. So there are a whole host of different variations of these terms. Next slide, please. So what did we find, or more importantly, what we didn't find? There really is not a lot out there with specific interventions, tailored interventions to increase physical activity among youth and under-resourced communities. Now, we did find 8 studies that were either longitudinal, quasi-experimental, evaluate activity. So we saw one perspective among adolescent girls. You see impact effects of trail development of a path or a trail. We had 2 studies that did use marketing media campaigns as the intervention. And then we had one with wayfinding. But the real takeaway here is there isn't much out there on specific tailored interventions that are deliberate to increase trail use for physical activity in under-resourced communities. Next slide, please. So we did find, correlates, which we know are very different than what we're looking at intervention, but we did see papers that are out there related to access, road congestion, active travel, lack of sidewalks, being in closer proximity. We saw availability of maybe trails and parks. You improve a park, you improve a trail, a green space might increase activity. And so those correlates are important because they do help when we talk about planning and potential policy implementation to get more kids out on trail for physical activity. And then you see a lot of some of the barriers, right? We know costs, and that cost could be related to, hey, I don't have access to a bike to be on the trail. I don't have access to maybe other things related to physical activity I might use on the trail. Or I don't have transportation to get to a trail. I don't have role models. I don't see people who look like me on the trail. And then perceptions of crime. And then, of course, just institutional discrimination. Next slide, please. So when we looked at then, overall, we didn't get a lot of data to promote interventions because there weren't many interventions out there. So we know we need to do more, and we have to fund researchers who actually are doing programs, which I think many of you are, to specifically have interventions to increase physical activity among under-resourced youth in under-resourced communities. So we know there's a body of evidence that demonstrates some of this, and that's what I was referring to in that program brief, and we just need more of that. So those of you who are running programs, and I know many of you are doing bike clubs and things like that, the more data that you can collect, it's going to help us drive policy in the future. The programs that you are leading right now, it's essential, and they're so important because for researchers like me, I need to find out about those programs. So we do know there's evidence there. It's just we don't have enough of that data. So we need to be much more deliberate on using trails and biking. We have a great program in my community in Greenville, Momentum Bike Club, that uses bikes to get kids out on trail for physical activity. We just need to be much more deliberate and systematic efforts to focus on those under-resourced youth in those under-resourced communities. Next slide. And so when we get to really the next steps is we need to be more data, right? We now have more research showing just being close to a green space can improve health as well as improving your physical health by being outside. There's just limited evidence and understanding of how trails impact those from under-resourced communities, and we need more evidence to be able to come out with recommendations. So the work so many of you are doing on this panel, as well as those who are participating and watching, is so important. And getting that data can then help us promote that physical health, that social health, that mental health that we know physical activity is linked to. Next slide. So I just want to say thank you very much for the opportunity. Please reach out to me on Hova or Huva, or you can just go to my email at Furman, and I will get back to you if you have any additional questions or looking for any additional information on this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reed. We have a number of questions, and one thing I want to start with, maybe just going from your conclusion there, is that do you have any recommendations for a lot of these organizations in the audience to start tracking that data, or potentially opportunities for securing funding for evaluation, for example?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Well, one thing we know is many of these children and youth now have smartphones, right? And if you have a smartphone, you can collect some of that data very simply, just because it has an activity tracker built into it. And you don't have to share all your information, of course, for confidentiality purposes, but even just some basic information you give to the program lead, like, hey, how active were we today? Getting the age of the kids, a little bit about their gender, ethnicity, but no identifiable information. One of the co-authors, Michael Hill from U.S. Forest Service, talks a lot about that, is if we have these devices and they become pretty ubiquitous, even among young kids, that is a great way to collect some of this data, or just basic survey data, right? And doing it throughout the year. So you just have an idea of who is part of your program, and what are the different things that you have done in your program. Really going to help us from the research standpoint. From an evaluation standpoint, where to get funds, you'd be surprised on how many opportunities there are in the private foundation space. Yes, of course, there are federal programs like NIH and the CDC that do have grants, and those grants are pretty arduous, and even for researchers, they're extraordinarily to get that funding. But I've been relatively successful in just talking to my community private foundations, and it doesn't have to be a lot of money. You could reach out to a community foundation and get $5,000 per. You might not is a lot of money, but when you talk about evaluation, it's not a ton of money. And just say, hey, we have these kids out on trails, but we get some evidence, some data to support that. I think we can actually get more kids out, and that happened in my community. We have the Swamp Rabbit Trail in Greenville, and our data now is being used throughout the world. And early on, nobody wanted to give us this money for evaluation. They were like, well, we see people out on the trail. Why is it that important? And then we were able to demonstrate who's using, and more importantly, who's not using. And then we were using that data to say, hey, we got to put spur trails in these under-resourced communities, right? Because we're not seeing a high proportion of kids and youth and adults even from those communities, and we're not seeing a true Greenville. If 77% of people in Greenville are white, we should be seeing maybe 23% from different groups. Well, we weren't seeing that. 93% of the people on the trail were white. So that evaluation is really important, because evaluation drives policy, and then policy drives evaluation. So looking into just small community grants, and that, your local grocery store chain has grants and things of that nature. I'm happy to help you. If you have additional questions, reach out to me, because I know a whole bunch of different organizations that are national that have these $5,000 to $10,000 grants, and those applications are not that hard.
That's great. And maybe we'll add another section within Huva, so all of us can start sharing those grant opportunities to really help do those, collect that data and evaluations, and move this forward. So thank you again so much, Dr. Reed. There are a couple additional questions that might be put through Huva, but again, thank you for your time, and we really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Happy to do it.
Thank you. And with that, we will move on to our next presenter, Michael Anderson from the Wisconsin Bike Fed. And I believe, Michael, I will hand over screen sharing to you.
Thank you, Esther. And I'm really excited to present to all of the attendees today. And thank you, Dr. Reed. I, as a programmer, took a lot away from that. So thank you. My presentation is going to be a little different today, more on the qualitative programming side here. So I hope you come away inspired from the work we're doing with youth bike clubs, but then also how we're embedding that youth voice into projects that our city is doing in terms of infrastructure safety. So I'm Michael Anderson. I'm a program manager. I manage the Wisconsin Bike Fed's Safe Routes to School programming in Milwaukee. We've been doing programs for about 15 years, and it's been very focused on bicycle skills, 2-week bike curriculum, bicycle camps, clubs. And when we came back from the Safe Routes to School conference in November of 2019, we came back really inspired about including youth voices in our city's infrastructure projects and neighborhood development plans. And through some of our work at one of the MPS sites that we are on their community school leadership team, we were able to really include youth voice in a meaningful way in the infrastructure project that was being built. So the city's multimodal team at the Department of Public Works received a federal transportation alternatives program grant, which allowed them to improve the infrastructure at 8 school sites. And their brilliant associate planner, Marissa Meyer, developed this method with maps and little pieces of the infrastructure all plotted out, and really was bringing in the community and different stakeholders in a really beautiful way of engagement for those projects. And early in the winter of 2020, through our role on their community school leadership team, we saw the opportunity to include youth voices in this process, to take the workshop that Marissa had developed and then develop a curriculum and have the kids all participate in it. So 120 students, 4th and 5th graders, had a week-long curriculum that really taught them to be junior urbanists. And they learned social studies, they had math and budgeting lessons that were largely instructed by their homeroom teacher. In this image here, we have some of their teachers here who were really excited to hear them share essays. I'll get to that in a moment. And what we learned here is that our theory going into this was, yeah, of course, kids should be included in the process. And we shouldn't have been shocked, but some of the beautiful and nuanced things that they said and that they contributed to the plan were really brilliant. So we found that when students had the necessary tools and information, their own experiences centered them as experts in the neighborhood. So in this photograph here, we have a student pointing towards what I believe is 19th Street and Hayes. All of the school stop and go pickup drop-off traffic gets rerouted through the parking lot onto this street. And they had identified that as a spot of concern for students walking and congestion in general in that particular point. In order to achieve this week-long curriculum culminating in this workshop, we gave the students each individual roles. So we had engineers, we had accountants, we had orators, and so students really had real-world implications and roles in their own development plan for the city. And all the notes that we took during their sessions, they turned into persuasive essays that were then submitted to Common Council and the Department of Public Works. It was a really joyous occasion. There's some more text here, so I'll share the link with this and you can go through it at your own pace after the presentation. Included here are 4 of the different students' essays that they wrote, so you can see the breadth of understanding that they developed of the issues facing them walking on their streets, and how nuanced where and what pieces of infrastructure they thought were going to make the necessary traffic calming changes to their neighborhood. This student here, her name was Britley. She said there are some streets that should be fixed for the safety of students at Lincoln Avenue School and for the safety of pedestrians, bikers, and also for cars. I thought it was really interesting hearing their perspectives of who else beside themselves were they thinking of. And we found that youth have a different sense of empathy than adults would in community workshops. I'm going to scroll fast through these to save some time here. So those culminated in persuasive essays. Those got submitted to the Common Council. We also do bike programming, bike clubs at Lincoln Avenue. So these are some of the pictures here. Mark is here. This is from last summer's early in the pandemic. We were still running bike camps. His essay is here. It's very good. He is also currently in his last week of summer bike camp. So very exciting. They were out all day in the 90-degree heat. In response to the pandemic, Marissa and the DPW's multimodal team changed the second round of engagement to be an outdoor community walk, and our staff provided some pedestrian safety aspects for these walks. And that was really beautiful, despite so many things being shut down, to see some of the students who participated come full circle and be able to see that the city had actually taken their input into consideration, and that now that they were involved in the process again. Their infrastructure changes that were determined here are going to get built in the summer of 2022. So it's still coming. So that's the immediate term, how we've included youth voice in the street design process in Milwaukee and improving access in places that really aren't built or facilitated for safe walking and biking. Through the pandemic, we also picked up a character called Mike the Chicken. This was a way to engage students on more of a long-range program development plan, partnering with the Department of City Development. So the Zablocki's Green Team was meeting virtually every Wednesday, and we developed a series of lessons that culminated in them making their own neighborhood signs to slow down traffic, bilingual, and part of these Green Team lessons was sending out Mike the Chicken dressed as a chicken out into the environment on a mission. So they would vote on something, and then to keep them engaged and showing up to virtual school, they would see me biking somewhere and doing something absurd dressed as a chicken. So at your own time, you can watch the Mike the Chicken Goes Grocery Shopping video. And so they were really excited when we sent them out into the community on a photo safari with their very own laminated chicken. And this input was all provided through 6 different sessions with the Department of City Development. So both our Department of City Development and Department of Public Works have been really involved through the pandemic of changing some procedures and listening to youth and thinking about schools more critically. All right, in the last few moments I have here, I'm gonna talk about how we have kept people rolling, and how not only is the planning and infrastructure really important, but showing up to that school and providing that real world experience. So at Lincoln Avenue School here, we have the Martinez family, who we took on a champion training ride, visiting 3 different MPS sites in their neighborhood. And we've kept our camps going. Last year, they were the ramen riders, and right now they're riding out as the chorizo bikers, playing follow the leader before they head out. What I think is really exciting about the Lincoln Avenue camp, especially, is that they're going to be seeing their infrastructure plan come to fruition before next summer's bike camp begins. So we're working with 5th through 8th graders on the bike camp level. So the students that participated in the program will be going into 8th grade next year, and they'll actually get to see their plan and to see that the city's listening to them. And the camp at Lincoln Avenue is not just a blip. We have 12 different programs, bike camps and programs running in the city of Milwaukee. 9 of those 12 are serving Milwaukee public school students. So in terms of access in under-resourced communities, we're really, we need to scale up to reach every community, but I'm very proud of the work that our team is doing. And as I mentioned, the infrastructure project at Lincoln was funded through a federal transportation alternatives program grant, but based upon the success of that work, the city is funding our first Safe Routes local infrastructure project. And this site, Westside Academy, we've also been engaging through a bike camp. This is a turkey, don't worry, at one of our bike camps. And here they are riding down on what used to be it's part of what's called the Beer Line Trail. So it's a Rails to Trails project. And the reason it's really meaningful to have these students come and interact with this switchback here. We've got one almost off the grass there. Is because that in their own neighborhood right next to Westside Academy, not only is it on a future planned low stress bike boulevard, but there's also the 30th Street Industrial Corridor. So it's part of a potential Rails to Trails project. And what we've learned from peer cities like Minneapolis is that if the community's not involved in such a massive project from the beginning, and that they're not, and if they don't have economic benefits from the project, it can be damaging, even if the infrastructure does facilitate cycling. So we want to make sure that our students are an important part of that corridor development, and that their families who live right there are economically benefiting from it as well. I mentioned that bike boulevard, 10 of 100 miles of low stress streets that were laid out in the Milwaukee 2010 bike plan, only 10 of 100 have been built. So coming from a community advocacy and educator standpoint, I'm really excited to see where some of our ARPA money gets spent this coming year. It's a very, very exciting time for what's possible, and including youth voices in the future, as the city's demonstrated a commitment to. And then part of that, it's not just about getting kids to far destinations, but destinations that are short and in their own neighborhood. There's a beautiful new play field that's only 1.5 miles from Westside Academy. If the city was able to fund the Brown Street Bicycle Boulevard with ARPA funding, it would really make this an accessible, safe place for youth. So really centering around these smiling faces and thinking about making our roads for them, for the most vulnerable users of the road. We still have another month of bike programming, but it's been going really well so far. We've had some fun destinations. And of course, as our campers from OW Homes will say, bucks in six. Find my email right here, and I will drop a link in the chat.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. Really, really neat work. And kind of through this project, what do you think you've learned from including youth voice that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise?
Oh, well, the thing that's been most concerning this year, and it kind of goes back to what Dr. Reed said, is a lack of activity, and especially during the pandemic, there was even less. I mean, we're still there, but in virtual school, even less activity. So when youth were taken, bridging from the in-classroom experience to even just a simple walk or biking on the playground, the connections they really quickly make from activity and what they're capable of is very powerful. And we're seeing things, they're thinking of older generations, they're thinking of neighbors in ways that I think adults are just a little bit too busy maybe to be thinking outside of themselves.
It's wonderful. And I'm sure that your work has inspired, many in the audience. And so do you have any, tips or resources out there that, for those interested in potentially starting their own community walks, or ideas that you might want to share?
For community walks, the answer is just start now, find a friend and go for a walk. So much happens that way. That's been another thing not mentioned here, that we've invested a lot of time and energy just promoting walking clubs this past year. And then look where the work's already happening. I pointed out to the Milwaukee 2010 bicycle plan numerous times. So there's likely something in your own community, like a plan at the city level that needs someone else to come in and support it or prop it up. Maybe it's a policy and not a law or referendum. There's something existing there that needs you as the advocate to prop it up, and then say, hey, actually, that's your demonstrated readiness or need, is cities already agreed to this. Let's execute it, and we're going to include kids in the process.
Great, thank you so much. And we're out of time for questions for now, but again, people will keep them coming in Whova, and we look forward to continuing to learn from the great work that Wisconsin Bike Fit is doing. Thank you. And with that, we'll move on to our next speaker, Leigh Ganzar.
Great. Thank you, Esther, for having me today. And thank you so much to the other speakers. I'm incredibly inspired by the amazing work and research that's occurring. I think my presentation will follow Michael's nicely. And I love the youth-led approach that they took in advocating for safe routes to school. Next slide. I'd also like to acknowledge the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living for their support. The vision of our research center is healthy children in a healthy world, which I think aligns really nicely with Outride and the theme of the Research Summit this year. So I'm excited to be able to present today. Next slide. So in this presentation today, I'll give a brief background on active commuting to school. Then I'll describe the City of Austin's innovative process for building new infrastructure to make it easier for kids to bike to school. And then I'll give an overview of our study that's evaluating the City of Austin Safe Routes to School infrastructure program, and describe some of the other data we're collecting around school policies. Next slide. So there are many health benefits to active commuting to school. As Dr. Reed mentioned earlier in this session, there is some evidence that active commuting to school, to or from school, is an important source of physical activity. And this is of particular importance in individuals who are already at risk of low physical activity levels, especially adolescents, females, and underserved youth. The diagram shown here shows the increase in moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity at the morning and afternoon travel periods. And this is for children who were walking compared to driving in a car. But this also relates to children who bike to school during these times. Active commuting to school is also related to cardiorespiratory fitness, although this is largely limited to just children who cycle due to its greater exercise intensity. And there are also promising findings that have been reported regarding active commuting in cardiometabolic health, muscular fitness, and psychosocial health, although additional research is needed in these areas. Next slide, please. But despite these benefits, over the past 50 years, the prevalence of active commuting to school has plummeted. These data shown here show the decline in active commuting from 47.7% in 1969 to just 10.9% of K through 8 students in 2017. And of this 10.9%, 10% were walkers, which means that only 0.9% of these students are biking to school. And if there's one thing that this summit has shown is all of the benefits of cycling. But this decline tracks almost perfectly with the rise of the use of the personal automobile for school travel. And there are a couple of reasons potentially for this decline. First is distance from school has increased, partly due to school preference and open transfer policies, urban sprawl, and school siting guidelines. Also, children's independent mobility has been decreasing over the past few decades, meaning that fewer children are allowed to travel to or from school without adult supervision. And also parental concerns about safety from both crime and road traffic are major deterrents of biking to school. Next slide, please. So because of this decline, it's important to understand what's driving the travel behavior choices and what factors are associated with active commuting. This social ecological model shows the multiple levels of influence on children's active commuting to school behavior. So at the center, we have individual level factors. And as we move outward, we see the interpersonal factors, community factors, which includes a lot of the school policies and social factors, and then moving into built environment and then larger policies. And interventions that target rings further out on this model have the potential to influence more people and potentially be a more sustainable intervention. Next slide, please. Safe routes to school initiatives are an important component of promoting active commuting to school. And there's the 6 E's of safe routes to school initiatives: education, engineering, evaluation, encouragement, engagement, and equity. The rest of my presentation today will focus on 2 of these: engineering, which focuses on creating physical improvements to the built environment that make walking and biking safer, more comfortable, and more convenient. So I'll give an overview of the City of Austin's safe routes to school in engineering process and infrastructure changes. And then evaluation, which determines which approaches are more or less successful. So for this, I'll describe the street study, which evaluates the health and behavior effects of the City of Austin's infrastructure changes. Next slide, please. So first, I'll go over the City of Austin's Safe Routes to School infrastructure program. And I'd like to thank Amir Amamian from the City of Austin for these slides describing their process, which is a really innovative and progressive program within the city. Next slide, please. In 2016, the City of Austin passed a $720 million bond for transportation, which allocated $27.5 million to safe routes to school, which is to be divided equally among the 10 city council districts. And the amount of funding that was designated for infrastructure in just this one community was larger than many states allocate for their safe routes to schools program, including a few years ago when the entire state of Texas was granted $28 million for 250 projects across the entire state. So it's really exciting, the amount of funding that's going into one community and the potential for the changes that can occur. So the approach that the city used for this funding was to first ask school stakeholders and community members what their concerns were around each elementary and middle school in Austin. They then conducted 105 walk audits and several community meetings to assess the barriers to safe walking and biking. And then after internal review and public comments, the city released their infrastructure reports for each city council district. Next slide, please. So there were more barriers identified than could be addressed with just this funding. So the city needed to identify priorities in terms of projects. So to do this, they conducted benefit analyses for each project that assessed the demand, the safety around each project, equity, and stakeholder input for each project. Next slide, please. So for each issue or barrier identified, there was a recommended project and then a benefit and a cost benefits. And this slide shows an example of some of these projects that were recommended, and then also where they fall along the benefit and cost benefit scores. So in total, there were over 4,600 recommended projects that were identified with an approximate cost for all of the projects of over $825 million. So while initially the 27.5 seems like a lot of funding, when we look at the need in Austin, which is not equally spread across the city, there is still substantial need. Next slide. So the guiding principles of the Safe Routes to School infrastructure program for how they're approaching using this funding is to implement projects that have a high or very high benefit scores, is the first. Second is to make meaningful walking and bicycling improvements near as many schools as possible. Third, for the 2016 mobility bond funding, balance funding equally per city council district as voted on by the public. And unfortunately, this means that the funding is not distributed equitably. Some city council districts have higher numbers of schools or higher needs in terms of their underlying built environment. But this mobility bond laid the groundwork for another bond that passed in 2020, which does not have the stipulation of equal distribution across the city. So that will really allow the city to focus on equity with their next round of improvements. And then finally, the Public Works Department is looking to leverage other available sources of funding to implement additional projects. So across the entire transportation bond, they're able to partner with the sidewalks program, the bike program, to try to see where certain projects could line up to help stretch the money even further. Next slide, please. So now I'll talk about the STREET study, which stands for the Safe Travel Environment Evaluation in Texas Schools study. And this is an NIH-funded study to assess the health effects of the 2016 Mobility Bonds Safe Routes to School program. Next slide, please. So the STREET study is a natural experiment, and it's unique in a couple different ways. First, we have other Central Texas schools for comparison. We're using objective measures of physical activity in our study, and we're evaluating at both the individual and the population level. The implications of our study are important because if we see changes in physical activity or changes in active commuting in a cost-effective manner, this city-driven initiative could be an effective and scalable model for other municipalities to improve their infrastructure as well. Next slide, please. The STREET study has three aims. The first is to identify the individual level effects on child physical activity of the infrastructure changes. And for this, we have recruited a quasi-experimental cohort of third grade students, and then we follow them through fifth grade. And we measure these students 4 times. And we measure child physical activity with both accelerometer and GPS. And then we also supplement this with surveys for both parents and children. Second is we're looking at the population level effects on active commuting. So for this, we're using a serial cross-sectional study design. And we have we use the standard Safe Routes to School tally where teachers in all 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade classrooms ask kids how they got to school that day and how they plan on getting home from school. And so kids raise their hands to indicate which travel mode they're taking. And then finally, we're doing a cost effectiveness study. So we'll use the physical activity and the final cost data for all the construction from the city of Austin to look at the relative return on investment. Next slide, please. One of the innovative components of this study is the use of both accelerometers and GPS devices that the children are wearing. So by combining these data, it'll allow us to objectively see the children's routes to and from school and how much physical activity they're getting on the journey. So these maps are from a different study. We're still in the process of data collection for us, but it shows an aggregate view of travel behavior for the participants in this study and where along the route we're seeing higher physical activity. So in this, the red dots indicate places where students were getting moderate to vigorous physical activity, and blue dots are showing very light or sedentary travel. So this will allow us to identify segments of the routes and areas of the neighborhood where active travel is very prevalent in an objective manner. Next slide, please. So the STREET study data have the potential to be used in a variety of ways. So one study we're looking at looks at the association between the number of school policies and practices in elementary schools that promote walking and biking, and the percent of trips that are made by active travel modes at those schools. And so we found that schools that reported higher numbers of policies and practices had higher percentages of students who walked or biked to school, which really provides evidence for the role of supplementing built environment interventions with school policies as well. And so some of these policies and practices included walking and biking curriculums, active commuting school signage, lane closures that drop off the pickup times, crossing guards, among others. And we also found that there were stronger effects in 5th grade students. So showing that, maybe there are other factors that are involved in the travel behavior choice in younger students, but that older students can be affected by school policies. Next slide, please. So an important part of policy is institutionalizing the policy or program to ensure sustainability. To assess this, we looked at the campus improvement plan for each elementary school in our study to look for the presence and the strength of school policies related to active commuting. This graph shows the presence of policies in 2 school years. Here we see that in the 2018-2019 school year, 36 elementary schools had a week policy related to active commuting, while in the 2019-2020 school year, only 5 elementary schools had weak policies, and 0 schools in both years had strong policies. And so a strong policy would include words, kind of binding words such as must, require, not words like should, can. Those would indicate a weak policy. So here we see that there's really a need to year over year include these policies in campus improvement plans. Next slide, please. And so here we see some model language that schools can use to institutionalize strong policies around active commuting to school for various policy types, including arrival and dismissal policies, education programming, and also community engagement. And so each of these policies has strong language, require, shall, things that, really, institutionalize the requirement for these policies at the elementary schools. Next slide. And then finally, I would just like to acknowledge all of our partners in this work. It's a really big team and an ambitious study. So I'm very proud of the work that we've been doing. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you may have.
Great. Thank you so much for your talk, Leanne. We do have a couple questions here. And the first is, do you have any examples of kind of successful or the more successful active commuting to school programs that you've seen, and what type of policies they've implemented and how that kind of looks in practice?
Yeah, one of the most successful programs that especially the city of Austin has seen is their use of crossing guards. The city of Austin has an amazing program where they employ crossing guards at almost every elementary school in the city. And so just having safe crossings at some of the most traveled and high traffic intersections has been, I think, made an incredible difference. And it's also really ingrained the Safe Routes to School program in the community because these crossing guards are at these intersections every day, and they're getting to know the kids and the communities. And so I think that was part of the reason why the mobility bond was able to pass, is because of how visible the crossing guard program is in the city.
Thank you. And then another question just came in asking you to, maybe I have to navigate backwards in my slides, but to see the list of strong policies again. And maybe what we can do is potentially, if I don't know if you have, we can put a PDF in the Whova app if you have examples of some of the policy language or other resources you'd like to share with the audience.
Yeah, I'm happy to share, and I can include a PDF of all my slides in the Whova app. But yeah, these are based on our research, based on input from our kind of expert investigators of ways to institutionalize these at schools.
Great. Well, thanks again. We now have to move on to the next speaker, but we really appreciate you taking the time to present today and look forward to continuing to see your work.
Thanks.
All right, so with that, we move on to our last speaker of the session, Dr. Andrea Hamre.
Hi, and can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, all right. And I'm not sure if my video is showing up.
Yep, I see both video and sound.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Andrea Hamre, and I want to thank Outride for the chance to present today. And I also want to thank my employer for supporting my presentation today, and Drs. Reed and Ganzar and Program Coordinator Anderson. It's been a real pleasure to learn with you today as well. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the white racialized identity I've inherited, and I offer this presentation in an effort to synthesize prior research and as part of my effort to practice allyship. And I also want to acknowledge this is a topic born out of frustration, pain, tragedy, and injustice, but I want to offer some hope today as well. Next slide, please. I think it would be helpful to review some terms being used in our discourse on law enforcement. Unfortunately, traffic enforcement violence is being confronted and reckoned with across all modes: transit, biking, walking, ride hailing, driving. Transit Center, a transit advocacy foundation, released this report earlier this month, Safety for All, and I thought included a really helpful review of different terms: police reform, reimagining public safety, defunding the police, and police abolition. Their report focuses on the concept of reimagining public safety, and my presentation will as well, and will briefly touch on police reform efforts as well. Next slide, please. So what is it that we're confronting here? We're confronting bike law enforcement being uneven and unfair, Black cyclists being stopped more than white cyclists, discriminatory enforcement of bike licensing laws based on racial profiling, helmet laws being disparately enforced, and violations while riding a bike turning into deadly encounters with police. Next slide. We're also confronting the lack of evidence that these bicycling related laws and ordinances have very little, if any, association with safety outcomes. The disparately high level of traffic enforcement imposed on Black neighborhoods and people would suggest proportionately higher levels of safety outcomes, but that is not the case. Jesus Barajas recently studied citations for biking on sidewalks in Chicago and found that cycling tickets are not really associated with safety, but instead are more likely to be associated with pretense for investigatory policing. In a congressional subcommittee hearing in February on traffic enforcement and safety, an expert testified that when the focus of traffic enforcement is on safety itself, there tends to be little evidence of bias and discriminatory practices. But when traffic enforcement is used as a pretext for investigatory policing, the evidence of bias and disparate impacts is strong. So these are key terms that will come up a few more times: pretense and investigatory policing. Next slide. So analysts and experts are forging a consensus around reimagining public safety. After an incident in April this year where a group of predominantly Black and Latino teens in New Jersey were confronted by police about weaving through traffic and then swarmed by officers, they had 4 bikes confiscated and 1 teen was taken into custody, all for not having bike licenses. The New Jersey Bike and Walk Coalition leader, Deborah Kagan, reflected these laws can be used for aggressive enforcement and create an overcriminalization of young bike riders, especially Black and Latinx youth. There's no documentation that licensing helps with safety, but it clearly creates a barrier for bike riding. Barry Friedman of NYU School of Law remarks succinctly, where there's discretion, there's discrimination. In an op-ed on traffic enforcement, Ramik Ives reflected that relying on an enforcement-centric approach to pedestrian and cyclist safety too often turns a blind eye to the vastly different lived experiences of Black and Brown people with law enforcement. And the League of American Bicyclists, in its 2014 Seeing and Believing in Bike Equity project, emphasized it's important to hear that people of color have good reasons to fear being physically unprotected in our public right-of-way and might feel that biking and walking projects should have lower priority than, for example, police brutality. Next slide. Graduate student Ethan Campbell, in an analysis of helmet law enforcement in the Seattle area, summarized, we can advocate rightly for the use of helmets without sending people to jail, giving them fines and potentially harming them. Reviewing the helmet law in place there is a valuable opportunity to address the issue of the law's deeply inequitable enforcement and refocus the goal on a broader definition of cyclist safety that does not involve police. After the killing of Dijon Kizé by LA law enforcement in August of last year, law professor Gregory Schill lamented that combined with law enforcement, these laws are a recipe for tragedy. And Barb Chamberlain of the Washington State DOT shared that if we are to say our streets are safe, this needs to include feeling free from the threat of harm simply for being present in the street. In a statement on the removal of enforcement from the League of American Bicyclists framework, the organization stated, racial disparities in over-policing of our streets is a barrier that prevents many from considering biking. Enforcement as a standalone traffic safety tactic is not particularly effective in achieving long-term safety outcomes. As Dr. Ganzar presented, the enforcement is no longer a part of the 6 E's of safe routes to schools similarly. Next slide, please. So I think it would be helpful to review some historical and legal evidence and context for racial bias, discrimination, and violence in traffic enforcement. I want to point out 2 books in particular, Sarah Seo's Policing the Open Road and Baumgartner and colleagues' Suspect Citizens. And Sarah Seo is a historian and law professor, and she describes how the role of policing has sort of continuously evolved and expanded since the introduction of automobiles. Despite the due process revolution of the sort of middle of the last century, traffic stops have remained a common tool for pretextual stops and investigatory policing, often motivated by drug enforcement. Over the years, courts have ensured law enforcement continues to be afforded a high degree of discretion. And as Seo states, whether policing discretion results in positive or negative experiences too often depends on race. Next slide, please. There have been calls for police reforms for decades, yet Alex Vitale makes the argument that police reforms have not worked. He systematically deconstructs arguments for different training, more diversity in police forces, procedural justice, community policing, increased independence of prosecutors, federal interventions and oversight, and body cameras, and says none of these get to the root of problems with policing. And I think in the realm of reimagining public safety, argues for disarming and rethinking the role of police. Next slide. So let's review some more specific evidence. While bicycling Black and Latinx riders are overrepresented in persons deemed suspicious by police, persons stopped or technically seized in terms of a seizure and searched by police, ticketing, citations, and arrests by police, and traffic assaults that result in excessive force, mental trauma, injury, and death. And where does this happen? It happens across the country. In Chicago, Black and Latinx neighborhoods accounted for 8 out of 10 of the most ticketed areas. In New Jersey, 15% of Black and Latinx cyclists reported being unfairly stopped by police while bicycling. In New Orleans, Black riders were involved in 67% of bike stops by police, and they were deemed suspect persons over 4 times as often as white riders. In Oakland, Black riders accounted for nearly 60% of all stops by police of bicyclists, and Black and Latinx riders were overrepresented in stops on reasonable suspicion and probable cause. They were also searched during stops more frequently than white riders, despite being less likely to be found with actual contraband. And Black cyclists were more frequently cited and arrested, while whites were more likely let off with a warning. And finally, in Washington, D.C., Black cyclists accounted for 88% of bike stops, and Black cyclists younger than 18 were stopped more than twice as often as white cyclists of all ages. 22 Black cyclists were stopped for suspicious activity, and 26 were stopped for being suspicious persons in the same time period that one white cyclist was stopped on suspicion. Many of these analyses have actually been undertaken by journalists digging into reports and combing headlines, and this is really because not enough data is readily collected and made available to the public about traffic enforcement. So one actionable takeaway is to request from your local elected officials and law enforcement that they collect and make publicly available detailed data on traffic enforcement that includes racial and ethnic identifiers. I think this echoes Dr. Reed's message about the need for more data to analyze and support evidence-based policy reform. And while biking and Black and Latinx riders report more fears and concerns regarding their personal safety, the possibility of being stopped by police, and they make more efforts to limit how often and where they ride due to safety and harassment fears and concerns. So when we think about building a lifelong practice of bicycling, how impactful that can be for youth of color. Together, all of these experiences have the cumulative effect of limiting the mobility, quality of life, dignity, and life chances of Black and Latinx people. This relates to Dr. Reed's discussion of daily physical activity attainment. It relates to Michael's discussion about the social and physical benefits of biking available to BIPOC youth, and the independence and sense of maturing that can happen as a young person when you start to move around your community on your own. For more on this, I want to highlight and direct you to the Arrested Mobility thesis by Charles T. Brown on over-policing of BIPOC mobility. Next slide. So we've reviewed what's been happening, the historical and legal context, the evidence, what promise or hope is there for a better future. I think this is certainly a case where the pursuit and implementation of policy and legal reforms and new approaches to public safety is outpacing our data collection and research. Communities around the country are reckoning with traffic enforcement bias, Berkeley, California being the earliest last summer to move toward removing the role of armed police officers in traffic stops. Other communities are pursuing de-escalation. Next slide, please. Illinois recently banned police from lying to minors in interrogations. I'm not sure I knew that was allowed beforehand. The role of police on subways and car stops for jaywalking and bike riding are all being examined. The consensus seems to be that the cost of these pretextual stops and investigatory policing is not worth the tragedies and trauma, and safety really needs to be recentered in our society's approach to managing traffic. Design changes and investment in historically neglected neighborhoods, decriminalization for things like jaywalking and sidewalk riding, and disarming of police are all being seriously considered. Next slide, please. So I'll conclude with some actionable takeaways and resources for further learning. In reimagining public safety, communities and states can repeal the laws and ordinances directed at bicyclists that are so often used for pretexts for stops and searches. They can also adopt alternatives that tend to de-escalate rather than escalate traffic stops. For example, instead of citing youth for not having a helmet or other related equipment, communities can give this equipment away to actually invest in the safety of bicyclists. There's also a growing consensus, as I mentioned, that reassignment of traffic stop duties to unarmed safety officers is critical for racial and social justice. In addition, investment in facilities, programs, policies, designs to actually increase bicyclist safety is critical, especially in areas of historic disinvestment and neglect. So as Dr. Ganzar discussed, the 2020 mobility bond that she shared will allow more of a focus on equity and safe routes to school investments is a great example. Next slide, please. For further learning, I again want to direct you to Charles T. Brown's work, Sarah Seo's work on policing and traffic stops, and a number of resources examining racial bias in traffic stops, as well as I mentioned Transit Center's new report, Safety for All. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamre, for that important and illuminating presentation. We'll be sure to take some of those resources as well and put them directly into Whova and some of those discussion boards so people can quickly access them. One question that we've come up is, I know you talked a little bit about this, but what role do you think schools and communities and youth organizations could play in kind of helping to keep youth safe during active transportation?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are so many ways, I think. I find it so hopeful, the safe routes to school investments and kind of reinvigoration I think we're seeing after kind of a decline in funding and support. And things like the walking and biking school buses sort of helping support youth who are trying to move independently in our communities or with an adult or two on their ride or walk to school. I think data collection, schools and other organizations can offer support for data collection efforts. You know, as I mentioned, some of these reforms are sort of outpacing the research, and so ideally we'd have a chance to sort of compare outcomes and what's happening as these things change. But so that comes to mind, and then I think really requesting or demanding, however you want to put it, you know, information from those who are trusted to serve and protect your community. So that those would be places to start, I think.
Well, thank you so much. I think, you know, as many of the audience here is invested in getting more youth on bikes and, you know, getting more people out riding in the community, this is really important information to keep everyone safe and out on their bikes in a equitable manner. So thanks again. We have to move on to break, but if there are additional questions from the audience, please do put them in the app and we'll be sure to get them answered by our panelists. Thanks again.